Now that we have a good understanding of the UI of Maya, let's go over how to actually create some objects. If you're in the Poly Modeling tab, you have access to some of the basic primitive creation buttons. If I click on the cube, I'll have a cube appear in the center of my screen. It should appear at 0, 0, 0 and be 1 by 1 by 1 unit. This is the default size for a cube. You can delete it by hitting delete or backspace. You can also create objects by coming up to the create menu on the top, coming down to polygon primitives, and you have a list of all of the primitives that Maya comes with. If your objects do not appear in the center of the world, it is likely you have interactive creation turned on. What interactive creation allows you to do is to dictate the size of the shape that you are creating. So I can left click, hold, and drag to have the base of my cube, and then drag up or down. This is not a feature I use very often, but it can be helpful for some specific situations. Another way to create objects is if you have nothing selected in your scene, you can hold down Shift and hold down right click. And in this radial menu, you have some of the most common primitives, and then at the bottom you have all of the others, including interactive creation. Not all primitives will be the same size. If you create a cube, turn off interactive creation, and then create a sphere, some will be slightly larger and slightly smaller, but all shapes will be consistent. So every cylinder will be the same size, every sphere will be the same size. Every primitive that you create has inputs, and these are allowing you to change the base shape. And you can manipulate that through the attribute editor and through the channel box. It does not matter which one you choose, so let's start in the attribute editor. If you come to the third tab, it'll say Polycube 1 or Polycube 2, how many cubes you have in the scene. And we have width, height, depth, and subdivisions width, height, and depth. And you can change the size of your cube or your object and change the amount of subdivisions it has, giving you more or less geometry to work with. It does not really matter if you change your width, height, depth in the polycube or in the actual scaling. The main difference is if you change it in the polycube, this is called the history channel. When you change your width, height, and depth, your scale will still be 1 by 1 by 1, meaning that this is the default shape of this cube. If I create another cube, I can get a very similar size by using the scale tool, or I can come to my attribute editor and type in how big or small I want the cube to be. The end result is the same, and you can choose whichever one you prefer. I find it to be a little bit easier to use the scale tool. When I increase the subdivisions of a cube, the cube does not look any different unless I am viewing the wireframe, and that's because every surface is flat. So instead of making a cube, let's create a sphere. And if you get in close, you can see that it is actually very jagged. You can see the flat face. You can turn up your subdivisions. You can see that my options are slightly different for a sphere than for a cube. But if I turn my subdivisions up, say 50 and 50, it'll be a much higher quality sphere than it was before. Likewise, I can turn it down and have a very low resolution sphere of just 3 sides on each. They give you some default options for UVs, which you don't really have to worry about. However, some objects will have more specific parameters. So let's create a cylinder, and we have the normal height and radius, as well as subdivisions. But you also have subdivision caps and round caps. If I turned on round caps, it'll be very pointing. And that's because I have subdivisions of 1. If I turn this up, you can round it out quite nicely. Without round caps turned on, I would just have more subdivisions on the top and bottom of my cylinder. There are a lot of different primitives that you can create. Some of them can be very helpful for getting relatively difficult shapes. And a lot of them do have some very specific features that others will not have. You have access to a very similar menu if you open the channel box and come down to Inputs, Polycube 1, or whatever the name of your object is, and you'll have the same width, height, depth, and subdivisions that you had access in the attribute editor. There's not much difference between the two. However, if you know you're going to have subdivisions of 5 by 5, you can just left click, drag and hold, and type in 5 and give yourself, can do all 3 at the same time. One other feature of interactive creation is the ability to allow you to place objects on another object. So I'm going to turn interactive creation on and create a cube. Then I'm going to hold down V, which is snap to vertex, and click on a vertex. You will have a very small primitive, but if you scale it up, the center of the cube will be right on top of that vertex, which can be quite helpful when you're trying to place objects in a specific way. When I am done with it, I always do turn it off. I encourage you to create some other primitives, see what some of their features are, because there are some very unique ones.